And now it's that time in the Oklahoma Memo Weekly Podcast. This is our second time doing this, where I talk with national podcaster, former News Niner, and political junkie all around, Grant Hermes from Make It Make Sense with Grant Hermes. If you're going to look this podcast up, you have to add in the with Grant Hermes. Welcome, Grant.
Always good to be here, Ryan. Thank you. Second time, definitely not the last time, right? We're going to keep doing this for a while.
Well, this is the federal shutdown inspired part of the podcast, and we're still shut down. So I thought this week we would talk about, get your take on what's happening in Washington, D.C. with the federal shutdown. What are you hearing? How long are we going to stay shut down? And then we have a couple other topics, but let's start with the shutdown.
Yeah, I mean, so like last week when we talked, we kind of got the appetizer of this thing. It hadn't happened yet, and it looked like it was going to happen, but we didn't know what was going to happen. This week, we've only been shut down for like just over 48 hours as we're talking right now, and two things are really interesting that are happening, I think. The first one is that the Republican line that Democrats are shutting down the government because they want to give free health care to undocumented immigrants. So first of all, that is not what's in the language of what Democrats put forward here. They're trying to save certain Affordable Care Act tax credits and subsidies and Medicaid access expansion that went into place under President Biden and have been backed up by the courts. Now, those expansions were given to people who came to the United States as asylum seekers or refugees and were given things like temporary parole status or temporary protected status. And so this line that Democrats want to give these folks free health care just patently isn't true. They're trying to do some tricky mental linguistic gymnastics here, rhetorical gymnastics, into the idea that, well, because the Biden administration, in J.D. Vance's words from the debate last year, waved a wand and made these people legal, even though they were legal asylum seekers or legal refugees. He was like, that actually makes them illegal because we can just wave the wand back. That's not how that works. And it's also just, once they've been made lawful, they've been made lawful. They're not undocumented anymore. So that thing is patently false on its face. And it isn't reaching people very well. It's just not working in the way that they wanted it to. And I think partly is because what they've been doing is putting out the actual Democratic proposal, and they've been highlighting portions that say alien health eligibility. And they've been trying to, imply that that means illegal alien. And when you read anything past the highlighted section, you get very clearly that it just says lawful immigrant and the people who fall into those categories I just talked about. And so people have seen that, and they know when they're being insulted, frankly. Like, it is one of those things where it's like, you expect me to not read past the highlight and be like, great, I'm done. Like, people are smarter than that now. And so that's part of it. The other thing that we know is happening right now, and I will talk about what the Democrats are doing because that's also equally interesting, but is that the other thing that's happening in the White House side of this, the Republican side of this, is that the White House wants to make the shutdown as painful as possible. I described it in the show sort of as like an abusive hostage taker, but it really is sort of more like the beatings will continue until morale improves, kind of negotiating, which is really weird for starters because, like, the president and his party control all of government. So it's not really like they don't have anybody who's straggling behind on their side of the aisle here. But what making this as painful as possible means is doing things like potentially mass firings. And the head of the Office of Management and Budget, a guy named Russell Vought, who was the architect of Project 2025, who said he wants federal workers to be in traumatic situations or to be traumatically affected when they go into work because he just doesn't like people who work for the federal government. He said that mass firings could start within a day or two. He said that on Thursday this week. So we could see it by the end of the day today. This administration loves doing a Friday news dump at 5 o'clock. So that way they can all leave for the weekend and not have to answer any questions, but also it dominates the news cycle all weekend. We haven't seen those things happen yet. But the idea that they want to make this as painful as possible to specifically Democratic states or democratically controlled states is just something that we have never, ever seen before. And that is also not working when it comes to public opinion. There were two polls that were put out this week, one from NPR, one from Washington Post. The one from the Washington Post came out yesterday on Thursday and found that 47% of people said that it was the fault of Republicans and the president for shutting the government down, and just like 30%, or I think just under 30% of Americans said it was the Democrats' fault. And about a quarter said they weren't sure. They didn't know if it was both sides or whose fault it was. So this stuff isn't working right now, but this idea is going to continue because it is kind of part of the plan they want to do when it comes to, let's be generous and say, shrinking the size of the government into a manageable way so that it can be lined up behind the president. That is the idea behind Project 2025 and what they want to do here. We could talk to a little bit about the legality of that. Do you want to get into that?
So in terms of first, I just want to note that Russell Vought he's giving Ron Swanson vibes. If you remember at the beginning of Parks and Rec, when Ron Swanson described his ideal government as one that really doesn't exist anymore. So you and I talked before we started recording. I asked you, I said, can the president just do this unilaterally? And you said,
No, I mean, it certainly doesn't seem that way. Now, I'm not a lawyer, right? But I do read a lot of these things, and I talk to lawyers, and I talk to people who have been government lawyers about these things. There's a specific thing called the Antideficiency Act, which at its very most simple is part of this thing. What it means is that the government is not allowed to spend money that hasn't been approved or appropriated yet. Full stop. There are some exceptions. I should say full stop. There are some exceptions for things like people who have to go to work for essential jobs during government shutdowns, but those people are getting paid after the shutdown is over. The idea here, when it comes to whether this is legal or illegal, is that if these mass firings happen, and some of these federal workers have been at work, they will have to get paid for the time that they worked immediately as they were fired, and they will get severance based on the government contracts that they have, because most of these federal employees are also parts of unions that come with pensions and come with these bargaining agreements. And people can differ about whether they like that or not, but there are severance packages here. When you get fired from any place, there's a severance package. And if they were to fire these folks, that would run afoul of the Antideficiency Act because they would have to pay them with money that we don't have yet. And that's different than borrowing money or raising the debt ceiling, because that is getting money. That's complicated economic stuff. This is like, is it in the ledger? It's not in the ledger because we don't have a budget yet because the government's shut down. Well, then we can't pay these people. It means we cannot fire them. It also... And there was a dude who hopped in my comments yesterday after I put up my episode about this thing, who was like, well, Obama punished Republicans in 2013, and Trump just gets to do it now. He can actually do whatever the hell he wants. That also just isn't true. There are certain guardrails and mechanisms on this. The way that the office of the president is set up, the executive branch is set up in the Constitution, is that it really is just supposed to follow and carry out what Congress sets forward when it comes to the money. And yes, there are some certain Supreme Court and some certain Department of Justice opinions about how much leeway the executive branch can have here. But generally speaking, the president can't just do these things unilaterally. It will at some point run afoul of the checks and balances that we all remember from high school civics. And so that's where we're at here.
So in Oklahoma, and for the Oklahomans watching this, which it's probably going to be mostly Oklahomans, you had noted that the president is wanting to make this particularly painful for blue states, which Oklahoma is definitely not that. It's the one of the reddest of the red. It doesn't mean that Oklahoma is not going to feel the pain, though.
Right. And you're going to see that in the ways that we talked about last week, too, which is you're going to start to see that pressure build on things like TSA, air traffic control. You're going to see it at the government levels, people trying to get approved for Social Security. Some checks will still go out, but that will run out once those checks have been fully doled out. You're not going to get another one. They might be slow to get to you because the person who's supposed to send them out has been furloughed or isn't coming into work. You will see that too when it comes to Medicaid and Medicare and Affordable Care Act things. And then you'll see that in places too, like the folks have to go out, like I said last week, and inspect the oil rigs and the fields, make sure those folks are safe, to make sure that the people who run ranches and butcher our food and to make sure those places are safe for us to consume that food, but also make sure that those workers are safe and those animals are safe and healthy. And that's just, that part of it. We also will likely see a slowdown of federal money that's coming into the state of Oklahoma for things like education, which we already saw a slowdown already, but things like roads and bridges, the basic stuff that we think, that the government should do. Most people agree that the government should do those big things like that. You're also going to start to see a squeeze on military families because those men and women still have to go to work. They still got to drive to Tinker every day. And that's why I reference because it was in Oklahoma City, but it's all across the state. And their money isn't coming in. So at some point, like, those families are going to have to struggle with that. There's a large contingency of military families who are on things like food stamps or WIC benefits, and that money will run out rapidly as well. There's a whole host of these things that the longer this goes on, the worse this is going to feel. And if they fire all these people, that's going to happen faster. And so it will trickle into red states really, really quickly. And that actually brings me to a thought that I had before about the healthcare thing, is that when it comes to who gets healthcare and who doesn't, Oklahoma does rely pretty heavily on federally subsidized access to healthcare. And if these healthcare extensions don't happen, that the Democrats want, what will happen on November 1st is that a lot of people will, I think it's about 3 million people, I'm pretty sure that's the right number. That many people will get booted off of Medicaid, Affordable Care Act access. What will then happen on November 1st is that for almost everybody, our insurance premiums will jump. Some people, it will jump, it will double. Some people, it will approach triple. And that will affect everybody because of how insurance companies work. And that will affect red states, states like Oklahoma, that tend to be less wealthy. That will affect those families hard. And that's at stake here, definitely.
So, and it's not like we're in the middle of the year. We're in the fourth quarter. And the longer we get in the fourth quarter, the closer we get to the holiday season, which is a painful pinch, and it becomes very emotional for families. I told you about the Robert Reich saying that he thinks the thing that would cause President Trump to compromise, some might say cave, I'll just say compromise, would be if a bunch of air traffic controllers don't come in and travel starts to get messed up. What's your take right now, just reading the tea leaves, in terms of, will we be talking about this next week, and what would be the thing or the things that would cause this to come to an end?
So I think there are two things here. The first one is air traffic controllers is a great place to look for these things because it interrupts people's vacations, it interrupts them traveling to places they absolutely have to get to. It interrupts business across the country. And so that's a real problem. And those people, when they're affected, are loud. And that reaches the president, that reaches Republicans. There is a certain contingency of this administration and of Republicans in both the House and the Senate right now who think that there should be some pain felt by all Americans for, the greater good in their eyes. And they may not be as receptive to that. There's also precedent with, the way that Ronald Reagan handled air traffic controllers during their strike in the 80s. And so they may lean on some of that precedent there. I think that maybe the better way to look at this is where the government is already stretched really thin. And that is in what they're doing around immigration. That is ICE agents, that's DHS, law enforcement officers from the Department of Justice, FBI, ATF, DEA. Thousands of those folks were either let go earlier this year or were reassigned from their jobs, which means to immigration, which means that they're not really there for the mission of what they signed up for in the first place. I mean, you've got FBI agents who were assigned to doing check and art crimes and are now doing immigration, and that's just not what they do. Or people who were working on domestic terror, or organizations and those investigations, and were moved to immigration enforcement to patrol around cities and things like that. So once the money runs out to pay those people, and because those folks were deemed essential and are going to work. It's why you're still seeing ICE agents, in Chicago this week. Once the money runs out, you're going to start to see people not go into work. And it's not maybe at first going to be those folks on the streets, the folks doing the arrest, but it'll be the people back at the office who are doing the paperwork, who are making sure at the Department of Justice that when an ICE agent goes into a place, that they're going to have legal cover to do that thing, to make sure that all their ducks are in a row. And those people are the ones who are going to stop coming into work because they're not getting paid after a certain amount of time. And those folks also have unions of their own with collective bargaining. So I think that might be a better way, is once you start seeing rumblings from the unions of these places, but then things slowing down a little bit when it comes to arrests from ICE or where agents are, that's a good indication that the pressure is being felt in reverse on the White House and Republicans.
So I want to remind everybody out there that the way that you can keep up with what Grant is keeping up with is to subscribe to the Make It Make Sense with Grant Hermes Substack. Make sure you're finding that podcast. I was able to find it easily on Spotify when you first started doing this. But let's transition just very, very quickly, because we're just running short on time here. But let's transition from feeling the pain to bringing the pain. Pete Hegseth and his speech to our soldiers, or not really our soldiers, our generals. He gathered them for essentially a warrior speech. A lot of people have already heard about this, but what's the reaction in Washington to what he did and the president's appearance?
So there's a lot of disbelief right now about this, from rank and file members of the military, from the stuff that the people I've been talking to who exist in those worlds still. I worked in Killeen, Texas for about a year and a half, just over that, which is Fort Hood. So I was on Fort Hood pretty much every single day when I was down there, and know these people intimately, how their lives work, how this would have been received. And the first thing is that if you don't know, Pete Hegseth basically wants to roll back what the Department of Defense, or the Department of War on paper is what it's called now, has been doing for the last 35 years or so. He wants to take basic training back to a place that looks a little more like Full Metal Jacket than what it is now, even though we've moved away from those things because that style of training soldiers doesn't work as well in making them good soldiers or Marines or sailors or Coast Guard members or any of those things, or airmen. And what this speech was this new direction for this. And it was really, really interesting. And there's a thing that will stick with me from this entire thing, both the Hegseth and Trump speech. And the Trump speech, I think we should talk about because that has more implications here. But is that the silence of these generals. And now they're not going to applaud and clap at every applause line. It's not like a State of the Union address. But it wasn't a silence like they were sitting there in awe of what they were hearing, or even that they were contemplating this thing. It was like the awkward silence when a comedian bombs, kind of a thing. Like it was really something to see. And like the after images that were snapped right after this thing was over were also something you could see on the faces of these generals, 800 or so generals and their staff, that this was something that was so, at the very least, inappropriate for how they were talked to. Just the tone of it was really something. The other part of this was that Trump decided, and when we talked last week, we didn't know Trump was going to be there. And so Trump decided to show up to this thing, and he talked, it was highly political in this speech, which normally presidents leave that at the door when they talk to military members, because their job as the military is apolitical. They're not supposed to be a part of our domestic Republican-Democrat back and forth. Trump doesn't see a divide between that at all. That's been pretty clear, both in his first term and in this term so far. And what he said was that we are facing a war within, and talked about sending the military into democratically controlled cities, which he's been talking about for a while, but we're not talking to top generals. And some of them may, whether they like it or not, may take that as a direct order and are waiting for those orders. But it's the fact that it's the American president standing in front of a large American flag, like, Patton, talking to hundreds of top military brass, saying that our enemy is within U.S. borders, and we are going to use the military to fight them and to target people that oppose the president politically. And that is just a place we have not been since the American Civil War, truly. And that is, it sounds hyperbolic, and it felt hyperbolic when it was happening. And it feels like, I'm over-exaggerating something here, but I'm just not. Like, that is what the president said to these men, and mostly men and women, but mostly men. And it was just such an out-of-the-norm speech that it really has rankled a lot of people. There are real concerns about what has to happen next, what could happen next, what might happen within the military. There was pushback when Trump tried to do this during his first term from members of the military. There are fewer guardrails around him, and there may just be some fatigue among people within the military who aren't directly around Trump, because they've been pushing back against these ideas for so long now. So we'll see what happens with that. But it was an incredibly abnormal speech. And I know we're running short on time here, but like
Yeah.
pointing to how abnormal things are right now is still important. Just because, courts may agree with the abnormalness or those things, it's still important to say that this is breaking a norm, because that's important, because we need to remember where the baseline is.
We think about human nature. I mean, both of us in our existence in the TV world, if a news director came out and gave us that speech, there's a phrase in the business world, quiet quitting. I mean, that's not in the nature of generals and admirals and these are serious people. I remember Fitzwallace on West Wing. They don't play. They're very, very serious, accomplished, capable people. I mean, are they just gonna follow along with whatever he says?
I don't know. I think some will, just because they'll go along to keep their posts, keep their positions, because firings are coming. They're going to continue. Hegseth was clear about that. Trump was clear about that. They both did these little like loyalty oath tests sort of things in their speeches, which was a very bizarre moment. The president asked these generals to raise their hands on whether they disapproved of the chairman of the army, and like that was bizarre. And obviously nobody raised their hands. They're not going to sign up for that thing, and also they're not going to make a private opinion public among their peers. But there are laws around and military codes that surround how the military operates when it comes to things that they think are unlawful, orders they think are unlawful. And those concerns go up and down the chain. Obviously, Pete Hegseth is trying to root some of that out. He calls those folks complainers. But if it's a general, kind of hard to, call that dude a complainer who's been in the Army for 30 years and has, Purple Hearts and a piece of lead in his shoulder. Like it's hard to do that. So I don't know. There's also a chance, too, that things will escalate to a point where the public won't like the way this looks. Most recently, troops were sent into Memphis, Tennessee, which does have one of the highest crime rates in the country and has for a long time. And the way that troops and federal agents, because Trump also doesn't see a difference between troops and federal agents, even though the military is the military and the law enforcement is trained to be law enforcement. They're very different things. But the way that's being carried out, and they're being told to carry that out, will wane on the public. People aren't going to like that. And doing that in a state that is a red state is going to, I think, be the first test of this. It's one thing to get a bunch of public support when it's Chicago or DC or LA from Trump's base. Those folks like that. It's another thing when it's people on their side of the aisle who are facing the brunt of these things, and that could temper some of this. And I'm optimistic in that way, cautiously, but I think that there are a lot of steps before we get to a place in which, like, we've got, U.S. tanks rolling into New York or something. We're a long way off from that.
Well, that's good. It's today Memphis, tomorrow Tulsa, and Oklahoma City. So I'm going to put on, if you remember the McLaughlin group, my John McLaughlin. So Jack Germond, are we still shut down next week?
I give it a 50-50 shot. There's not a bunch of movement happening right now. Like I said, the White House wants to do this thing where they put as much pressure as possible and then say it's because the Democrats are making them do it, even though they're all in power. 50-50. A week is a long time to be shut down. We'll see what happens, but half and half. Something might move over the weekend. If not, maybe midweek next week. I think we might be looking at least a deal for a deal.
Fantastic. Grant, I always learn something when I talk to you, which is what I appreciate most, both about you and your digital entities. Make it make sense with Grant Hermes, and we will talk about this next week and see where we are. Thank you so much, Grant.
As always, man, it's a pleasure to be here.